very warm welcome to all our attendees. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on delivering the IMYC, a conversation between schools. I'd like to run through a few housekeeping points before we start our webinar today. Please ensure that your microphone is always on mute so we do not have any background noise during the webinar and the sound can be as clear as possible for all attendees. There will be an opportunity for a live Q&A with our presenter, so please do type any questions you may have during the webinar into the chat box directly to Fieldwork Education, as you can see on the screen. And my colleagues will collate these questions at the end of the webinar. We would also encourage you to share your thoughts during the discussion taking place today as well. If you do not wish to see the chat box or hear notifications, as this can be a little distracting while the webinar is taking place, kindly close the chat now or disable the notification sounds. If you are having any difficulty with sound, kindly check your sound settings. Alternatively, you can leave the meeting and rejoin, and this should resolve the issue. As we have people joining us from all over the world, there may be intermittent bandwidth issues, so please do bear with us if you experience any delays or lags in connection. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available soon after it is complete. We are grateful to all of you who are providing us with feedback on this webinar series and proposing topics for future sessions. We invite you to participate in a short post-webinar survey. You can use your phone camera to scan our QR code to access the survey. We will show this code again at the end of the session, or alternatively, you can use the link that will be sent to you with the recording. An alternative way to give us your feedback is through our online poll during the webinar itself. You can access this poll by following the directions on the screen now. Click on the polling drop-down option and you can complete the survey during the course of this session. Once completed, kindly click on Submit and your responses will be saved. Our panel of experienced educators will today be participating in a roundtable discussion about their experiences in delivering the IMYC remotely over the past few months, and their thoughts for how we might take learning forward for this age group. During their discussion, we welcome you in sharing your thoughts, ideas, and any questions that you may have. It is my pleasure to welcome our roundtable today. Danielle Machon, the IMYC leader and trainer at Noordangmeer International School in Rotterdam. Rico Chow, the secondary school principal at Verita International School, Bucharest. Colin Gear, IMYC leader and trainer at the International School of Koje in South Korea. And Jason Shulman, head of teaching and learning at Sir Manasseh Meyer International School in Singapore. We welcome Danielle Machon, who will be facilitating the discussion today and is the IMYC leader and trainer at Noordangmeer International School. Danielle, welcome.
Good morning. I hope everyone can see me and hear me. And thank you for having us on the discussion this morning. Well, morning for me and afternoon for others. And thank you for the lovely invitation and welcome. I hope everyone can see me and hear me okay. I want to give a chance for everybody to introduce themselves personally if they like, and the panel can turn on their videos so we can see this. And like the introduction said, it's going to be a conversation between schools, which is a little bit different than maybe more conventional webinars where you're used to projecting information, talking over the slides, and kind of disseminating information. But as the invitation at the beginning said, we really want it to be an active discussion. We're a panel of experienced teachers, but we are a community, a global community, so we want to invite everyone into that conversation. So please be as active as you can in the poll. So as the introduction said, my name is Danielle, and I'm here in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and I have experience teaching the IMYC as well as leading and training the IMYC. And I see a few familiar faces on the chat box in the window there, so it's nice to see everybody and welcome. I'll let our other panel members introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Rico. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I've worked in secondary education in Canada, Middle East, and Europe. I'm now based in Eastern Europe in Bucharest, Romania, working at Verita International School. It's my third year here, and I have the pleasure of overseeing day-to-day operations and learning for the secondary school. And in terms of COVID, my school has been closed since March 16th and was instructed to reopen in September. So we've been closed full out, haven't been back to school, having a mix of synchronous and asynchronous learning. And it's been eye-opening. And I look forward to sharing and having these conversations with our panelists and interacting with all of you as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Rico.
I'll go next, then I'll jump in. Hello, everyone. My name's Colin Gear. I am the IMYC leader, and I also work as an IMYC trainer. I'm currently based at the International School of Koje in South Korea, where I've been working roughly for the last 6 years and have been involved with the IMYC for all of those 6 years. So I've really enjoyed that. In terms of our school context, we just finished our school year. We were closed for the best part of, I think, 3 months from February into May. We opened up mid-May again in Korea up until the end of the school year. So we had about 4 or 5 weeks back in the school with sort of more stringent, tight school regulations to go along with that. So we've had the context of having both the online digital learning and then the new learning environment in the school with a lot of these COVID regulations in place. And I look forward to the discussion to share some of the experiences there.
Thank you, Colin.
So hi, my name is Jason Shulman. I'm coming from Australia, Melbourne, and now I'm working in Singapore. So my role is Head of Teaching and Learning at Summative International School. I'll commence my 3rd year in August. This has been an incredible opportunity to navigate an international learning landscape, especially in a place like Singapore, and bringing in the IMYC curriculum has afforded me with a rich opportunity to immerse myself in an environment where educational excellence is at the fore. And as we continue to develop this seminal educational excellence where I'm currently working at, we're also very challenged by the response of COVID-19 and what does online or remote learning look like for us. It's been an incredible journey, and it's a journey that is still omnipresent. So I look forward to being amongst my esteemed colleagues from around the world with this opportunity to share best practice, life as a teacher navigating this online space, and how the IMYC has supported us in being able to deliver a rich curriculum online.
Yes, thank you, Jason. And welcome, everybody. I guess we'll jump into it, and you can probably see on your slide in the background, there's a few headlines from different news media outlets. And I think, the reason we wanted to kick off with this is that our audience are teenagers and young adolescents, and we know that those needs are, quite unique. And this kind of need to balance autonomy and supporting their independence while at the same time nurturing and supporting them so that they're not left alone. And I think during this really unique time, it's an opportunity for us to reflect on how we have approached that kind of crisis, adapted it, and looking forward to the kind of opportunities that we have looking into our next academic school year. So with that, that's kind of the 3 words. If we want to cue to the next slide, one of the ways that we've decided as a panel to approach our discussion today is through those key words of crisis, adaptation, and opportunity. So we'll kind of, again, open it up for a discussion, but the first thing we want to talk about is, as our panel said, we've all come from different school contexts that have, based on the national guidelines, as well as your school guidelines, had to respond to the crisis of COVID in unique and different ways. And then we want to talk a little bit, well, how have we adapted to that? What kinds of systems operationally have we had to move around and adjust? And also the actual curriculum. Like we're saying, this is the IMYC, and there's certain components of the curriculum that we're going to discuss and hear from you guys how you've adapted that curriculum to make it really successful for our teenage audience. And then finally, where are we going next? What did we learn from this experience? And how can we move forward in a really, with optimism and realism combined? And what are we doing in different strategies that we can share amongst the panel and from you, our audience today? How are we going to look forward to our next year or our next term, depending which hemisphere your school context is under? So thank you and welcome. And yeah, please add to the chat box at any time. We want this to be as much of a conversation as possible. And I don't know if our panel has any other comments on our introduction, if I'm missing anything.
Just an overview. Absolutely great.
Super. Shall we move on to our first kind of talking point then? Let's hear from you. And how did your school respond? And I know you've kind of introduced your school context a little bit, Shulman, but maybe you could give us a little bit more detail about how your school context influenced that response.
I'm happy to go.
Who wants to reach out and speak first?
Well, I just wait because I know we had the question there as well. Are we wanting to address this specific question then, Danielle? It's up on just now.
Maybe it might be. Yeah, we can use the focus questions, and you can maybe link it back to that context and situation that you've had to deal with, so we understand how those decisions you made at your school from your situation. And the first question that we thought to kind of discuss and invite our audience to chime in. How are you addressing the emotional well-being of middle year students as a teacher, but then also at a leadership level? Because we know that those are two different kinds of needs and ways that we support the emotional well-being of teens. So please.
Rico, you've got principalship here, so maybe you should go first.
All right, I was waiting. I was just like, so from my context in Bucharest, Romania, we were instructed to close on March 17th, and we had to act very quickly. And one of the most important things that we tried to put in place and transfer was the focus on social emotional learning. So our school puts a lot of emphasis on social emotional learning, and it was kind of thinking about how do we maintain that in an online setting. So in terms of addressing the emotional well-being, we've made a lot of adjustments in terms of meeting the needs of the teenage brain. Because knowing how difficult these past 3 months have been for adults, one can only imagine the impact it has on these adolescents where their brain is still going through so many changes, pruning all these connections. So we focused a lot on less is more. What I mean by that is we're not worried about hitting objectives. We're not worried about assessments. We're not worried about all these things. Of course, we're looking at how to maintain that. But for us as a school that focuses a lot on the kindness aspect, we focused a lot on maintaining consistency, compassion, and connection. So making sure that there is a platform for students to interact with each other, to connect with each other, to be active, to learn something new. So some of the things that my school has done to kind of alleviate some of these pressures were we tried to do online after school clubs to give a chance for these students to interact without the pressure of a classroom, shall we say. We had cooking clubs, all these things, but we've scaled back a lot on what we wanted to cover in terms of the IMYC learning objectives. We just wanted to focus on the core, what's most important right now, and it's the connection between students and teachers and having that opportunity to interact with each other. So from that standpoint, we've scaled back a lot in terms of what we would be doing in school. That's kind of what we've done on kind of the big picture leadership level. And I'll pass it back over to you.
Thanks, Rico. I just want to highlight one thing that you said that really stood out for me, and it was consistency, compassion, and connection. And I know all of us who work with adolescents, I think that's I mean, you've just captured that in such a beautiful way about how we balance that need for, supporting them and nurturing them, but also giving them that kind of sense of autonomy that we know that they need, even during such a unique time like this. So thank you, Rico, for that. I don't know, Jason, if you want to pick up from that?
Sure. I think what's been an incredible learning opportunity for us in Singapore has been the mandated curriculum that we deliver at our school. So when using the word mandated, it's an expectation that this particular curriculum is delivered. It's the IMYC, it's the IPC in the primary. And as educators, I think it comes naturally that you follow a scheme of learning, a scope and sequence of learning informed by your curriculum framework. And suddenly, even though we say that we're very much about the head, heart and soul of our students, informed by a rich curriculum and excellence and academic excellence being at the fore of what we stand for, we were incredibly challenged, because suddenly, as Rico more than intimated, our focus was on the well-being of students and how are we going to navigate engagement in an educational space where we don't think we're ticking boxes, but we are. We're spending 6 to 8 to 10 weeks, starting with our entry point. We traverse through the curriculum, and we've got it in the calendars. We've got catering for the parents who will be joining us. The students will be preparing for this expose of learning in the foyer of the school or one of the classrooms. And suddenly, the dynamic has changed, where we can't complete it in the way that we've been used to, and it really shows that even though we are adaptable, we're creatures of habit. And it's just been an amazing opportunity for us to shift our learning and our pedagogy online, to even change the way we address students. So we would consider ourselves as being quite affable to our students, and suddenly we realise actually we're actually quite instructional in the way we sometimes deliver our classes. And suddenly we start our lessons online with, how are you going? What's happening? How's your day been? You move from being Mr. Shulman, you start having this conversation with your students like it's Jason conversing. Why haven't I always conversed? I thought I had that connection with the students that was personable. And this has really been a fantastic opportunity for us to build rapport, build relationships with our students, still engage in the learning process, but the IMYC personal goals have also sort of been infused explicitly into our learning, and it's been wonderful. Our students, it's quite opposite to what we would have expected, but the feedback we've just received, so we finished last Friday for summer break, is they want to stay online, and not just because they can wake up, I dare say, half an hour later, but they've really enjoyed this. They've really become involved in the learning process. I think a point of difference that we have engaged our students through summative assessment, and that's a conversation perhaps for a little bit later on. But yeah, it's just been transformational. I don't know if anything's really shifted our pedagogy and our approaches to learning quite like this COVID opportunity, I dare say.
Thank you, Jason. I just want to kind of again highlight a few key things that really stood out for me and maybe differently for others. But I think what you're really talking about is, we prefaced it with the needs of adolescents, and we know that structure and routine are things that make, all people, but especially adolescents, feel secure and safe. And I think one thing you really highlighted for us is we had to create a new routine so that safety and security is still evident for them, and they seek that through that kind of narrowing that formality or relationship, so that they feel a closer connection to you in this kind of more virtual setting. And then of course, just peeling back everything with the formality of a curriculum, what's really important and why are we here? And, the emotional well-being of our students, that's the center of it, isn't it? Yeah. So thank you, Jason. I guess I'll turn it off to Colin to tell us how, in your context, you really been addressing the social emotional needs of students in this unique time.
Yeah, it's interesting because with the way our school context was, it went very different for us in the way that the online learning happened. We were in the middle of a 2-week school vacation when the Korean Ministry of Education announced the shutdown. And what had happened is, because this is a time where Korea was one of the few countries who were spiking at the time, obviously it ended up spreading here, there, and everywhere. But the companies that our parents worked for, because it's a very shipyard dependent industry, the companies evacuated our kids back to their home countries. So suddenly we were in the context of, we had a certain student population, quite a large one, significant in America. We had a large student population in Kazakhstan. We had student population in India, and some still based in Korea, a few in Canada, a few in Singapore. And so almost in some of that structure and routine that probably was easier to implement when you had children on the same time zones became way difficult for us. We couldn't really get that personal contact because we couldn't really find a time zone where we could get all the kids together very often without it making them making American kids work into the evening and saying that 8 p.m. is their school time. And well-being wise, that didn't feel appropriate to me. So we ended up having to, in most cases, work very asynchronously with constant contact, which meant that I guess we as teachers were on alert a lot more, but it made it work as best we could in the context. One thing I tried to do, and this was actually a survey I sent out, is we were doing sort of learning showcase assemblies once every couple of weeks. And I got the feel from that they really enjoyed that one time locked in for a sense of school community. So I sent a quick survey out to my students just saying, look, I'm understanding you quite like this time together. Obviously, it's very hard to get together, but if we have one time a week where we can do that, would you like this? Is this something, if I facilitate this every week for you guys, is this something you'll be interested in doing? And I think it came back about 85% yes. So they wanted that weekly marker point. So that was one thing where, although we couldn't do it all the time because of the spread, we could still find those times and spaces to still get everyone together and have those moments. And even for that small percentage who couldn't make it, I could then put those recordings up for them to enjoy later. But that's, it's not the same dynamic when you're not there live. I think one thing that everyone's realized is that there's no way to operate under a normal school timetable and a normal school demand. The important thing in terms of putting that well-being first is that we ensure that learning's still moving forward, their education's moving forward, but at a pace where they're not going to be feeling overwhelmed, because these kids are getting bombarded with the news coverage. And I'm thinking particularly with the kids who are evacuated over to America, particularly the ones in Texas, that was a really tough time for them. They're getting bombarded with that news every day, seeing these cases getting spread. And so, they have a lot of time to process. And so we don't necessarily want to start overloading them. But one thing is, I know some schools cut back to okay, we're going to focus on numeracy, we're going to focus on literacy, we're going to focus on the core subjects. But what we try to do is still find time for those specialist subjects like art and music and languages, not in any same level of demand, but just that thing of, sometimes that's what they don't want to have a wall of maths lessons and then not having that outlet for using their artistic skills, or that outlet for using their music skills, or that outlet for exploring new languages. So still trying to find a way where we can cut back, but still cater to the fact that we still want that variety and we want to find that balance. So we found we basically created essentially a subject timetable of, when these subjects are going to be posting lessons online, shared out with the parents, shared out with the community to say, this week, these are the subjects we'll be working on. Next week, these will be the subjects, to ensure that we were still keeping that healthy balance for their well-being, but that they could still get an exposure to everything. And what I actually found is, because we almost felt more isolated from our kids than normal, because we couldn't quite get together very often, is that those relationships we'd built in school actually ended up being a little bit more distant. So we had to do things like we'd work with a school counsellor we'd done well-being surveys and check-in conversations and meetings like that. to have regular check-ins. So it was a very unique situation. And even when we came back, you know, we still had that population who couldn't get out of America and who couldn't get out of countries they were living in. So we still had those students who were online population to support afterwards as well. And again, we made sure that we kept that, although we could increase the schedule for the kids in school, we made sure that we're still keeping that proper balanced schedule outside the school as well, with sort of well-being at the heart of that. So there was a lot to think about in a very short period of time, but it was a really interesting experience.
Yeah, I think, Colin, if I can, again, kind of pull a few key points. I think what's really similar from all of your stories you've been sharing already is that it's about structures and supports and having students' voice represented. So I think what's interesting, you mentioned, you know, you ask students, what do you want? What do you need? And asking for their input in a really genuine, meaningful way. Like, is it helpful for you in our context to have one meeting per week that we are synchronous and we are maintaining that sense of belonging and sense of community? You know, I think that's really powerful. And I think the same thing you're saying about a curriculum that's for all of the children's, you know, interests in the whole, like looking at the whole child. Those are the ways that we, you know, we know from research, but we know from experience as classroom teachers that that's how we support and reach into our students. So yeah, I want to thank you for that. I don't know if you guys want to add a couple comments to each other, or if we want to move on to another question for discussion.
So something that I wanted to add was that it was really interesting because when we moved online and we've kind of shortened our, you know, a normal kind of typical day-to-day secondary schedule, you know, probably 8 periods of 40-minute classes, that very typical. So obviously that's not feasible online. And we've kind of shortened it into 30-minute periods that only runs from 9:30 to 1:30 with a few breaks in between. But from 1:30 to 3, we would have student-teacher conferences, one-on-one student-teacher conferences. And what was really interesting was a lot of the staff found it so eye-opening and so almost like an aha moment where, oh, wow, a lot of these students that they see as trouble students in class, oh, they can speak eloquently. Oh, they have a mind of their own. Oh, they're quite intelligent, actually. And we found that having these kind of one-on-one meetings, we were able to do more of these compared to a typical schedule where secondary schedule is quite busy, where would you fit that in the sense? So we're kind of brainstorming, how can we maintain these student conferences as we move back to the new school year? Because this has been a key component in terms of meeting that emotional well-being of these students, when students are comfortable to share their concerns with the subjects or what's going on in their life in a one-on-one setting. Because if you think about it, when we're having these, if you're having synchronous sessions online with everyone in the call, there's no small conversations between a student and a teacher. Whatever the student is saying, everyone hears. So we found the student-teacher conference is really helpful with addressing these emotional well-being. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Super, thank you, Rico. I think, yeah, you're highlighting one more time about that, you know, personal connection and reaching into our students. Does anyone else want to add something before we move on to another question?
I just think it's interesting. I think it's interesting listening to Colin's situation, in that some students had travelled back home, and so the school was, of course, honouring their educational responsibilities in continuing to facilitate learning, and trying to unpack that in my mind, some of the difficulties that we had in at times bringing students online, because they were feeling rather taken aback by the whole being at home and living in isolation, figuratively speaking, to then trying to facilitate learning, not vicariously, but learning from a distance, using a different time schedule. That's fascinating. That's a fascinating story, Colin. Just to hear that, perhaps live lessons were being facilitated across time zones. I'm trying to I'm trying to compartmentalize what that might have been like for you.
I mean, as I was saying, yeah, obviously with that context, we ended up having to have like a lot more asynchronous with like one-to-one check-ins and availability that way. But still trying to, again, at the heart of it, still find some way that we could get all the learners together into one. But it certainly wasn't, we couldn't quite launch as synchronously as other schools where you're just all in the same time zone. And it's really just a matter of, okay, all come on at this time. So it was a lot more one-to-ones and check-ins than it was sort of bigger group classroom environments.
Yeah. I see we have a couple questions in our chat box, and I think I just want to acknowledge that a few people have posted in already. So thank you for that, and keep posting in there. I think at the end of the session, we've kind of planned for some more kind of one-on-one Q&A. But I know we have a few other topics to chat about, and still thinking about how we've adapted to, how we have approached the crisis. So I think if we want to switch to our next slide, we can look at another talking point. So yes, safeguarding is really a topic that has come up for a number of schools that I've been in contact with recently. How we monitor and protect students at home. How are your school communities managing safeguarding? I'm very interested to hear. I don't know if Rico, since maybe from a leadership perspective, if you want to share that, because that is a different responsibility around safeguarding. Not to say that we don't have equal responsibility. I don't mean to suggest that, but certainly from an administrative lens, if you want to share that.
Yeah, from an administrative lens, it's such a gray area. It's so murky where there's no clarity on it, because this remote learning and this remote safeguarding, it's new for everyone. It's uncharted territory, and schools around the world are kind of administrators figuring out what works best with their context. And I think that's something very, very important to highlight. Is the most important thing is to focus on what is your context, because a context in my school or in my region may be very different in another context. So in terms of safeguarding at-risk students, the few things to remember is that with the quarantine and staying at home, there's been a rise of domestic violence across the world. And this has been, as the looking after the child protection policy and looking after the safeguarding policy, there has been a lot of adjustments needed. What my school's done was, the first thing we did was to make sure parents all sign consent forms to make sure that their cameras are allowed to be on during a live session, and that the lessons are recorded. Now, the reason why we request the cameras to be on, and also if you're in Europe, all the stuff with GDPR, why it's so important to get that consent form everyone signed, is because when that camera is on, one, you can make sure the student's there. Two, at least when the camera is on for the duration of the class, the student is protected in a sense against any domestic violence, because it is recorded. Because we have to remember that for some students, the school is their safe haven. And for some students, their home might not be a great place. So with a lot of these things, there's no right way to do it. But what our schools decided was that because we wanted to make sure some of the at-risk students are protected and more safe, we made the decision to ask parents to sign their consent forms to make sure cameras are on. The lessons are recorded. All lessons are recorded and deleted after 2 weeks. All one-on-one meetings are recorded, because just like you would when you're meeting a student one-on-one in school, you would probably want to meet them open doors or have another adult present. So another thing that we also made an effort to do was we have weekly counselor check-ins with those students who have had some issues already prior to closing. So some of the students that we have been monitoring already, but it's been so much more important and difficult to keep all staff informed, because you don't see your staff daily now, you don't see your colleagues daily. It's been so hard to maintain that clarity and that consistency just across everyone. So we've literally just have a very simple Google Doc with some of the students that we needed to pay a little more extra attention to, some of the concerns we have for them, a lot of parent meetings, because for those at-risk students, they get hit the hardest. They get hit the hardest for these past 3 months if they've already been struggling at home. So from a leadership point of view, these are kind of the things we've put in place. I know that some schools don't have cameras on, and I know that some schools do. There's no right answer at this point. As I said, you have to do what your child protection policy and safeguarding policy said, and follow your school's designated safeguarding lead for these areas, because it is so different. So my logistics and scenario might not be applicable to another school because of what's in place. So most important thing is to follow your school's designated safeguarding lead for a lot of these areas, because it's so great. I couldn't find a clear answer, which is really annoying.
Thank you, Rico, for that. I don't know if Colin or Jason, if you want to jump in and either comment on Rico or add some of your own experiences addressing safeguarding with a new virtual learning environment.
I mean, my contribution really is like, yeah, our vice principal is our safeguarding lead, and so he set forward the policies in place in terms of logging, the logging of meetings and logging of any kind of web conferencing or anything like that. So in terms of our safeguarding procedures, the only thing I agree with Rico on that one, and what I done in my school is followed my safeguarding lead in terms of the policies and procedures in place, and stuck to that and sort of had that as my guidance. But beyond that, I don't know if I have much more to offer for this question.
Thanks, Colin.
I think my response is not too dissimilar to Nico's. So I'm a member of the senior leadership team, and we actually started with a process of discernment of trying to identify the best platform to deliver online learning. So here in Singapore, there was initially a fair bit of transparency between the international schools and the local schools. So we were communicating with our colleagues at the MOE, which is the Ministry of Education, and trying to see how they were implementing this online learning platform with the child's online wellbeing and safety at the fore of our thinking. We went for a particular product. It was the Teams. I won't refer to there's no product placement here today, but yeah, we're using Teams, and we found it to be an effective way of delivering, because we felt that we were quite in control of not just the delivery of the curriculum and the conversations that we were having with students, but also an expectation that students would be online, their cameras would be on. And then once we realised that over a short period of time, some students were not turning on their cameras, there was something up, what we decided as a senior team is to appoint students to a group of teachers, and for teachers to be mentors. So once a week, in this sort of situation, in fact, in all situations, as a teacher still in the classroom, even though I'm in a leadership role, all teaching staff were assigned 1 or 2 students, and every week we connected. We made calendar requests with the students. We asked them to have the cameras on. We asked their parents to be present if they wanted their parents to be present. Every second week, we spoke to the parents with the student there as well. And we kept a log. So without using sort of academic speak, it was how are they going, anything that we need to note, and actions. And we would contact our Senko and we would work with them if we felt that a student was in need of some support. What we started to identify is that for all students, the framework of trauma-informed practice started to really become something. It became a topic of conversation amongst the staff, because we realised that for a majority of our students, they were being significantly impacted by this COVID situation, and hence a lot of the trauma-informed practice guidelines and suggested support helped us to effectively support our students. We worked with all the mentors to make sure that they were providing the support, but also making sure that they were sharing information with leadership, with our Senko. It was it took a lot of time, but we saw it as our moral responsibility as educators. It's the least we could do. And similarly, as teachers in line management positions, we would meet our staff more regularly, because this conversation is primarily focused on the students and their learning, and there's also the teachers that we were incredibly concerned about, and many were impacted by this current situation as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all three of you for sharing your experiences around this really, really important topic. And I think, I'm sure there is plenty of entire webinars focused on this enormous topic, but I think when we talk about crisis, this is an important area to touch on. I just want to try and highlight a few things that kind of stood out for me amongst all three of you. And I think one of the key things I hear from all of you is around partnerships and working as a team, a school team, even in this kind of distance experience for faculty as well. But, you know, drawing on your designated safeguarding lead, drawing on your school counseling, drawing on your teachers to work together and know, you know, what information to share with each other so that we take a collective approach to safeguarding, and know that that's not an individual responsibility to bear, but we do so as a school community. And I think that really, I thank you for sharing those experiences. Yeah, and I think, of course, as Rico, you kind of kicked off talking about, working within legal frameworks, because we know that safeguarding, of course, is a really important legal framework, as well as, Jason, what you were saying about the moral responsibility around that. You know, there's two kind of prongs to that. So thank you. I don't know if there's anything else you want to touch on or raise around this topic, or we could move on to another discussion point.
Certainly created increased policy development over the next 6 months. We don't have policies for this. I mean, we do, for safeguarding we do, but if we delve deeper into, are we authentically providing those safeguards during 9 till 3 online to protect our students and their well-being? These are process documents at the moment that will effectively become policy, because I don't think any of us imagined that this was going to quite play out the way it has. Yes,
exactly. Shall we move on to adaptability and how we've kind of adapted? I think that's our next talking point. So we kind of discussed as a panel that we could look at the notion of adaptability through the lens of, teaching and leading, since a lot of our audience, of course, our participants, we work as a whole team. So we wanted to speak first about, this is the IMYC curriculum that we're talking about in today's webinar. That's our focus. We know there's, so many components to our, rich and complete curriculum, but how have we had to adapt to that and change and adjust? I know the three of you have already shared a few examples, but maybe we could go into a little bit more detail about, kind of the brass tacks, so to speak, of our curriculum. And I don't know if Colin, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the one thing is just, because when we started off talking about the 5 needs and particularly the context I was describing, the thing that just came into the forefront of my mind is the facilitation of peer-enriched learning when, everyone's in a different kind of time zone. And one of the things in looking at that, it brings me to how we were approaching entry points, for example. So one of the ones I was responsible for during, we were still doing distance learning was when people can work together, they achieve a common goal. And originally, it was an exciting trip over to an escape room that ended up obviously falling apart over time because I like to do escape room trips. And So we were looking at, okay, so the person I was working with, my colleague, and we were looking at, there's a lot of these online versions of this, and could we find a way to use them and have the children connecting together to solve those problems as sort of their entry point experience. And so what we ended up finding out doing is pairing up children based on suitable time zones and putting groupings that way. So when we released the material to the children, it was sort of, okay, this group, you're in the same time zone, so if you can get together and work and solve the puzzle, and then please then fill in this reflection on how you all worked together and what roles you played. So we're getting the evidence that they made the effort to do that as well. So we're seeing that and honestly, with our learners, it wasn't much of a push to get them to do that sort of thing. They're very comfortable working together at this point. And so that was one of the immediate things coming to mind is like, as best we could, finding out these grouping activities to, okay, if you're in this time zone, please try and work together, and then facilitating the reflection questions to get that sense that need was being addressed and that part of the 5 needs was catered for. You know, in terms of, it's obviously not the most ideal scenario to be in for that kind of thing, but it still seemed to be an enjoyable experience that they remembered and were talking about, and were excited to discuss in the Learning Showcase that week as well. So, you know, it seemed to have that, so we could still facilitate entry points in peers in a unique way. And I think there was things like working together on recipes for cooking things, and then me and you, Danielle, we ended up collaborating for entry points as well.
Yes, we did. You want to talk a little bit about that one, Colin?
Yeah, so
true confession. Colin and I are former colleagues, so we do know each other personally as well as professionally. So it wasn't just trying to exclude other schools.
Yes, it's because we were naturally conversing anyway as friends, and we realized that, I think, was it 2 of the 3 or all 3 were basically lined up perfect.
Yeah, two of the 3 were the same. We had the same units around the same transition point in the school calendar. Yeah.
So again, one thing we tried to do there is then we could actually all run the same activity, because we could get all the kids to record the videos of the activity, and suddenly we had examples from 2 schools. So again, when we had the Learning Showcase assemblies, they're not just getting to see what they did and their friends did, they're suddenly getting, okay, what happened to other schools as well. So again, just trying to pull in all this sort of networking. So that was certainly, in terms of the IMYC curriculum, that very first stage of entry point, there was actually a lot of opportunity to do things that we maybe wouldn't normally do as well in quite a fun and exciting way, and something that they really enjoyed as well. And having choice in those activities as well, that maybe we wouldn't, if we were having to run multiple teachers in charge of groups as opposed to being parents around, having that facility of choice of activity and entry point actually helped to facilitate things a lot. So that actually gave us, for entry points, a lot, I thought, a lot more excitement to them in terms of potential options than perhaps I would have thought, given the context. We already kind of talked about the sort of the day-to-day learning process and tasks and how we cut back and learning goal focus. And so I'll just touch on the exit point, which I think is the one where I found in conversations with most schools is the one they found the most difficult to facilitate at a distance learning situation, because when you're looking at trying to make sure that the children don't feel overwhelmed, a big, massive media project on top of their other learning can be quite a concern, going back to that well-being as well, and how do we find the balance of that. So I know when we were purely distance, one of the things I decided to do in discussion with my colleagues is not necessarily having a big media exit point, but instead something that still would be a marker of the end of the unit. So more of a larger unit reflection, how they've experienced things during this time, how they feel their learning's evolved during this time, and using that in conjunction with a lot of theatres, national theatres, were offering performances and plays. So trying to get a little bit of different culture in. So we kind of designed this activity where we matched up some of these UK National Theatre play productions to their big ideas. And we thought, okay, the children can get a bit of culture there. They can get home, they can enjoy the theatre from the comfort of their own home. And then when they're doing their sort of big end of unit reflection, they can also look at, okay, what themes from that production I just watched also came out and connected to my big idea, along with all the sort of teaching and learning things. So we didn't necessarily go to a full media project, but we still tried to find a little marker, like this is the end of the unit, you know this is the end of the unit, this is how we're going to conclude it, we're having an experience to conclude it before we move on to the next one. Once we came back into school, it was a bit easier to facilitate that. But even then, we were coming in about halfway through a unit, so we kept it a bit more low key. It was more focused on their reflections of COVID, and finding ways to connect that to the big idea. So we had, I think for year 9, for example, they had interpretation. Only a very few things are true for all people, and so they made photo journals with their feelings and emotions and how and showing that in connection to the big idea through their experiences during COVID. So again, we were trying, because we couldn't get the community coming in to watch or anything like that anyway. So keeping it a little bit more low key, but then starting to bring back in the elements. But I know for sure that's always been a big question, like a big project when they already have so much. How could we find ways to still give that experience and that marker without having them feel overwhelmed or impacting their emotional well-being?
Yeah, thank you, Colin. Just to kind of highlight, because I also see in our chat box, we have a comment about, how to maintain that social emotional connection amongst students. And I want to thank you for sharing the way that you have deliberately looked at your own context and been quite innovative to, especially with your situation with your students in, every corner of the globe. How have you managed to really, to solidify and make them feel like they have their peers, not just their teachers, as part of that sense of community, and particularly when, the entry and exit point component of our curriculum, that is an essential part of it, is the peer enriched learning. So thank you for sharing those. I don't know if Rico or Jason, if you want to jump in.
Well, the one thing you've affirmed, Colin, is I'm going to develop a strong relationship with Rico now, and we are going to work together. You're working with our esteemed colleague, and we're only a hop, skip, and a jump away from you, Colin. So, and Colin, as I've shared amongst the other panelists, has been incredibly supportive and provided some rich, immeasurable training for us. But sometimes the student needs to stand up to the teacher. So thank you, Colin. So one of the things we did was we actually reframed our terminology around the exit point to be a showcase of learning. So it was still under the auspices of a exit point, but to take away some of the pressures from the teachers to create a visual media presentation, we just wanted an end of unit showcase of learning, which was still in line with the process of learning that we enact as a school that implements the IMYC. What this did was it took a lot of the pressure off teachers, because we wanted them to focus on engagement rather than a complex, rich task that might not produce the results that they were hoping for. So with that change of language, students were actively participating. They didn't feel pressured. Our Year 8 students, for instance, rather than doing a showcase of learning, they finished off with some speeches on human rights, so in the justice unit that we were covering at the time, and they looked at 4 different areas around the world, and they came as sort of politicians, and they dressed up, and they took control of the screen for 45 minutes. It was, for me, it was immeasurable for me, because it was a moment of incredible emotion. I did get quite emotional, and in fact, one of the students said, "You're not." I'm like, "I don't know, I might be." It really took me a while. It really helped me realise why we do this as educators. So the entry point I actually found the entry point a little easier. The creativity entry point for us was was interesting because students were given some instructions, and they needed to share something that was personal about their own creative dispositions, and it really enables students to go back to their place of origin, go back to where they're comfortable. It was a very like a warm environment where students could just share their creative dispositions and their different acts of kindness that they do in their local community that is creative, something they do around the house. It was an opportunity for them to give of themselves through a well-being lens. So yeah, that's where we were at with the IMYC, but always from a place of well-being, always from a place that students felt safe in expressing themselves, but to try and sustain a curriculum focus and a pedagogic approach that none of us have ever used before, I dare say.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jason, for that. I think both you and Colin have really highlighted for us, like when you make learning a personal connection, that's how students learn. That's how they build those connections. And again, we keep coming back to the foundation of our curriculum and the needs of the adolescent brain. And we just know that when you have a personal investment in something and you emotionally connect to something, that learning is entrenched, and it's so powerful. And I just really want to thank both of you for really showing how, understanding is really what we're trying to go for. And, that's the way our curriculum has been built. And you, in your school contexts, have made, the personal component, that's a way to really reach into our students. So I want to thank you for that. I don't know, Rico, if you want to add a comment about how you've had to adapt your program.
Oh no, I will add. So, well, so while Colin and Jason here are, raving about their entry points and exit points, I'm gonna give you my story, okay? So our school's still quite new with the IMYC, IPC. We've been doing it for about 2 years. This year we made a lot of adjustments in terms of the number of units we're doing in a year for IMYC. So we used to have about 5 or 6, but we started to condense them down to 4 units a year, but jam-packing them with more learning objectives rather than spreading it out, because our school also has a lot of summative assessments, even with the year 7, 8, 9s. And we had a really good thing going with the exit point, which Danielle helped me a lot with. Setting up the exit points this year, so we had a good 2, 3 really successful exit points in school. It was a week long. We kind of saw these as passion projects, just an opportunity for students to showcase their learning in the way they want to showcase it while linking to the big idea. Now, unfortunately, with the COVID, so our school, my division, we didn't have the time or the resources to adapt with the entry points and exit points online. So I will be first to tell you that it's okay. I didn't do it. I didn't have the entry points or exit points. So what we instead focus a lot on. Sorry, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I don't think you're unique in that. Some of the other people that I've spoken to, other schools also. I don't think you find yourself in a situation at all with that.
Oh, that makes me feel better. Thanks, Colin. I was like, I'm committing a sin of the IMYC, no entry point or exit points. But kidding aside, but instead we focused a lot on the big idea. We focused a lot on that interlinking of learning that meets the teenage brain's needs. So we had to focus a lot more on the collaborative planning, or more specifically, horizontal planning. So we had to have a lot of discussions in teams where we're talking about, okay, so in English, I'm linking to the big idea in this way. In humanities, I'm linking it to this way. So having that clarity for students so they can see the connection between each subject. And so all teachers can see that, hey, I know that in PE, you're learning about adaptability in this way. Hey, I know that in history, you're learning about adaptability in this way. So I focused a lot on clarity and consistency because I think it's so important with delivering the IMYC in a very unconventional way in a remote setting. And as we moved forward with that, a lot of the staff found these collaborative meetings, these horizontal planning, where they have a very clear idea of what each teacher is doing, to be very useful for them to actually help students make those links in the classroom, in Google Meets. But ultimately, we went to, when it came for the assessments, we focused a lot on student agency and risk-taking. We focused a lot on just, hey, so a few things we kind of backtracked was, one, these are middle school students, year 7, 8, 9, or grade 6, grade 7, 8, depending what context you're in. They can catch up. They're not an IB diploma. They don't have IGCSEs. They don't have exams to worry about. They can catch up. So we focused a lot on, hey, let's just try to give complete student agency, because we know how hard it is to give student agency as you move forward to IGCSE or the IB diploma program, where it's so prescripted. So we focus a lot on the student agency and risk-taking with these projects, where teachers just said, hey, you know what, showcase however you want to showcase in terms of what you've learned in this unit. And teachers were very surprised. Teachers, it was a very nice eye-opening experience in terms of how do we, again, bring that adaptation for this period, for the IMYC, into the classroom. So no entry points or exit points, but instead we just focused solely explicitly on the interlinking of the learning for the teenager. That was our main focus. And I think it worked out well.
Super. Thank you, Rico. I think, yes, please don't feel intimidated by Jason and Colin's entry and exit point, extraordinaire. Because really, to have the courage to really dig into formalized planning, I think that shows, a lot of commitment to student learning. And like you say, interlinking learning to the big idea, that's how they develop understanding. And whether they showcase that through some kind of exit point, what you're doing is adapting to your context, but you are doing so without compromising student learning. And you're still maintaining that center of student learning, that's at the heart of what you're doing. So don't underestimate that. And I'm quite conscious of the time for everybody, and I don't want I want people's questions in the chat, of course, to have a chance to bring that into our conversation. So if it's fine with you, maybe we could move on to another talking point.
Yeah.
Super. We'll get this. There we go. So we've been talking about how we've confronted a crisis, adapted our curriculum to this crisis, but recognizing that for many of us, we're at the end of the school year or the school term. What are we taking forward? What did we learn from this? What opportunities do we have as we look forward and plan? So I'm very keen to look at this with optimism. So I think we have a specific question, if we want to move to the slide. As schools are slowly reopening, is there some kind of planned transition, or how are we going to approach implementing the IMYC as we look to whether it's your next term or your next school year to open up after, and even whether you're going to continue with distance learning or a combined context? I'm not sure. Maybe as you speak, could you share with us maybe how your school has gone back and returned end of term? Maybe give us a little bit more information about where you're at in that transition to reopening, and then look at sharing how your school team is approaching that. I don't know, who wants to kick us off? Volunteers?
Yeah, I can go first.
Yeah,
so our school is, first of all, it's following government regulations with all the social distancing. So in our context, I think we can't have more than 15 students in a classroom. So that definitely means that we're going to have to look at A days and B days from primary all the way up to secondary. So as of now, we are set to reopen in September in the classroom. There's a lot of different options we're looking at, so many different contexts, but we're looking at A days and B days like a lot of schools are, or perhaps A days and B days where half the students of a year 7 class are in the classroom, and maybe the class is streamed online for the other half of the students at home. Or it might be a flipped lesson where it's a video instruction, so students can follow at home and the students at school can have that interaction with the staff. So it's still quite up in the air right now because while our government here has provided some regulations and some framework in terms of what's expected, there's still a lot of things that's up in the air, which is a pain because I obviously don't want to be drafting up reopening plans over the summer, but it is what it is. So there's a lot of these things that are still up in the air. But in terms of supporting kind of the planned transition or helping students transitioning back in the class, I think it goes back to what I was saying before in terms of the importance of the connection and the compassion. You know, our kids here, when they go back in September, they would have not seen each other for 5 months. So really 5 months, and we know how important that peer group is for the teenage brain, where I always tell parents that, sorry, mom and dad, but the peers have stronger influence over your child than you do. And they hate it when I say that. But it's kind of thinking about what are the core essentials and again, kind of going back to the basics in terms of what's most important right now. How do we maintain and increase that compassion and that connection, even within the framework of social distancing and all the government regulations and stuff? Because obviously with social distancing, it's going to be a challenge for teachers in terms of thinking about how to have those collaborative activities when kids can't sit together. They have to sit 1.5 meters apart. So then we go back to that old archaic, rustic kind of, individual desk, which I hate. So thinking about that, there's a lot of these discussions which we're going to have in orientation week. But yeah, lots of things still up in the air. I would say if anyone is looking for reopening plan, I think the best one that I've read is the one from UNICEF. So the UNICEF one, I think out of all the reopening plans I have read, that's kind of the best one so far that works with a lot of school contexts. So I strongly encourage people to look at that if you're thinking about how to reopen, but that's my 2 cents.
Super, thank you, Rico. Jason or Colin, do you want to chime in and share some of your experiences?
Well, our local schools have returned today the whole complement of students. So from the 29th of June, all students return. The international schools operate slightly differently here in Singapore. So as they recommence, we're on summer break. It's going to be interesting to see, informed by the success and or otherwise of the return of the whole cohort, because we were having week A, week B. So year 7, so like year 5, 7, 9 were at school 1 week, and the following week 6 and 8 were at school, and they were having remote learning on their alternate weeks. So from the 29th, the government made the decision, everyone's back. I don't want to predict what might pervade in the coming weeks, because we're seeing other countries in the region going through, I don't know if it's a second wave or it's just a spike in cases. So what we've done is, the first thing we've done is we've acknowledged that online learning has been successful at SMMIS. So we have put into the calendar every 6 weeks, they'll be doing online learning day. Even if we return in the second week of August and everything's fine and we're all back at school, I don't know if it's what the new normal is, because it's a new normal every week. But if we're all back at school, then in late September, all of the secondary school will do an online learning day, because it's been successful. What we've also put in place is we've preempted that for our 8s going into 9, so our 8s will be commencing their IGCSEs in year 9. we're not 100% sure. So anecdotally and in conversation with the staff, they've assured me, and informed by their schemes of learning, that the students have enveloped the requisite skills to prepare them to traverse into their IGCSEs. But we're not sure whether they have enveloped the skills, and whether they've been imbued in such a way where they will translate into their learning across the first semester of IGCSE. So we're mindful of that. So we might need to do some preparatory work with our students coming from their IMYC into their IGCSE to ensure that we've prepared them accordingly. So there are so many dynamics that we're working through at the moment. We're trying to be solutions focused. We're trying to be strategic, but we're conscious of the fact that it's the operational that in many ways is leading us at the moment. But students will return to school on the 12th of August after their summer break. We hope they're returning physically back into the classrooms. And if they're not, I feel comfortable in that we've been relatively successful with the online learning timetable. But reading some of John Hattie's research this week, he's presented a paper back in Australia about the Christchurch earthquakes and what that did for student learning, for all those students who are unable to go to school for that period of time when the Christchurch earthquakes happened a couple of years ago. And he was able to prove that it was a deficit model for the students for a very short period of time. They caught up quickly. But what does this look like? I mean, this can go on. We don't know how long this is going to go on for. And so he hasn't reframed his position, but he's also said this was for the Christchurch. If this continues on for years, then our tertiary education, the tertiary education sector will need to address this, secondary, primary, etc. So I'm fascinated from a strategic viewpoint where we go with education. What is the new normal? I hate using that, but yeah, it's a fascinating reality that we all must acknowledge and take on board.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I think, yeah, if I may, one more time, just kind of like take a few highlights of what you're saying. I think what you have really touched on for us is that transition isn't just transitioning into the building, but transition is about, the transitioning of learning. So from primary into, the IMYC, or from the IMYC into, further secondary school learning, and, looking, as you say, about that, achievement gap or the potential for that, and how are we looking in the long term around that learning. And one thing I'm curious about too is you've talked about the kind of non-international schools in your setting returning to 100% school capacity, if I understand correctly. And I'm curious to know how much autonomy perhaps your school has with respect to the government guidelines in which you operate, and whether you need to follow those guidelines, or if you have more independence around that.
No. When it comes to the physical positioning of our student cohort in school or online, we are compliant with the MOE, with government standards. So the government does not afford us any autonomy whatsoever in how we position our personnel, whether it's staff, right, students, etc. And we think that's really important because of the contact tracing, and if we show the government that we are compliant, then they reciprocate, they provide us with support. We were recently all tested, so as part of the reopening of schools, all teachers in international schools who have a early learning centre in their midst, we're all tested. So we do. So we went out to the Polytechnic and we got tested, and we appreciate that the government has taken our needs into consideration as well. But when it comes to the pedagogy, the curriculum, the timetable, we are autonomous.
Right. Thank you for that, Jason. I just had the way you were speaking, I wasn't 100% clear. And I know, Rico, you were mentioning that you very much have to follow the 1.5 meters and guidelines from your school. And finally, Colin, we haven't forgotten about you. We of course want to hear about South Korea, so please.
No, I was just mulling it over, yeah, because again, we're the same. It's the Ministry of Education dictates all the policies we have in place, and I'll be honest, when we got the announcement that we were going to be reopening, like about 4 or 5 weeks before the end of term, particularly on a well-being level, I was quite concerned about what impact the students were, because I knew from the webinar, the learning showcases, the assemblies I'd been doing online, that they were very excited to be back in the building and see their friends. And the big question in my head at the time was, but this experience will be very different from the one that they left the school in, and how are they going to adjust to that, and what impact is that going to have on them? Because, yeah, you're looking at desks 2 meters apart, wearing masks all day, for, myself is included as well, no class mixing. So, like, in terms of being interacting with other classes and other year groups, that was even something as simple as break time. They all had to stay in their pods and in their year group things. And I know, for example, all our middle year students, a lot of them are very close between year groups, but they wouldn't really get those interactions. And so I had, on a well-being level, I was very worried about the transition and how they would take it. And I was pleasantly surprised, I must say, that we made the judgment call. The first thing we were going to do when they get back in the building is we weren't going to just start throwing them back into lessons. They were going to take some time, and they were going to be in their year groups with their tutors, their homeroom teachers, and they were going to have a chance to just debrief and talk about how they've been experiencing things, what the new regulations are, why we have to do this, get them sort of that mutual understanding and that mutual respect. And I was just so impressed that all the learners, they understood why they needed to do things. They knew that it wasn't ideal and it wasn't perfect, but they were happy to just be in the same building again and talk to each other again and see each other. Even though they were still doing that outside of school. I was hearing on the assemblies they're making TikTok videos together, playing Fortnite together or whatever, but it was still that direct interaction that they were very excited to have again. And I think that overwhelmed any of the negatives about all this desk separation and anything, and the masks and anything that went along with that. So as much as I was concerned going into it, having that time, I think it was very important to have that time and have those tutors and those ones who have the most personal connection with them to have those chats and really set the tone for them. And I think that all went and responded very well. One of the other things is that gave us the ability that the year 6 students who were going to be coming up to year 7, normally they'd get a sort of little sampler and come up and go to classes and all that kind of thing. But again, because of the mixing, and they talk to the middle year students and sit and have Q&A sessions. And again, because of the mixing, the classes couldn't happen, we couldn't really facilitate it in the same kind of way. So what I approached this year is I got in contact with the year 6 teacher, and I said, can you put together a Google Doc of questions that your class has about life in middle years? And then during a reflection class time, I put that as an assignment to all the middle year students, and they could answer all the year 6 questions. Then I went and sort of filtered through that for sort of the best, strongest responses, and shared that back up to the year 6 teacher. So they were still getting those Q&As and those personal experiences and what they went through and how they adjusted into middle years and what the differences are and all those experiences. They could still have that, even if it wasn't necessarily face-to-face. And one thing we could do, although they couldn't mix with other classes, we could still bring them up to the IMYC and have some sample lessons and meet their teachers and have that after they had their questions answered. So they'd had that Q&A, they'd got to get that background information, and we sort of transitioned up. And one thing we'll be continuing is one thing we do at the start of every year anyway. It's like an establishment phase for 2.5 days, where it's more about, the personal goals, the international mindedness, the school rules, the class agreements, and obviously in terms of the corona expectations and all that will now form part of that. And that again is an important part of that transition back into learning, to make sure that they're equipped, have a chance to ask questions, have a chance to understand, get that shared understanding of why we do things the way we do, and get everyone on the same page as they transition back into their their learning as well. So those are the kind of steps we've had. Fortunately, we haven't had to do A or B weeks or anything like that because our class sizes are so small, not so small, but small enough that we can fit our student class year group population in every day. So we haven't had to do any switching. I think, we've got like classes of around 10. So we could have every class in without that really impacting much on the day-to-day either. So we didn't get that negative impact either. We could and so all of that combined helped us sort of to, I'd say, have a surprisingly smooth transition. And I think it makes you realize, honestly, how resilient middle years learners actually are. I mean, they get that bad rep, that bad rep quite often. But I was delighted and surprised by the maturity and the understanding they showed during a very difficult time.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Colin. No, I think it's funny. It's no accident that our conversation continually comes back to, what are the needs of adolescents? And we started today's discussion around that, and the way the media portrays adolescents, can be at times a disconnect. And what we actually see in front of us are really incredibly adaptable and resilient, and all of our personal goals. They're something that they live. They don't just talk about or see on the teacher's display board. So thank you, Colin and Jason and Rico, for sharing those experiences. I think, again, very conscious of our time. I suppose, should we move on to kind of some closing comments? And maybe, I think we have another slide if we want. Yeah, oh, sorry, I forgot we have another question.
Oh no!
I'm very, but maybe we could keep this more concentrated and brief, and maybe just some real concrete, simple examples, if you could share them, instead of maybe a broader conversation. But talking about assessment, and a lot of teachers feel a great responsibility around validity and so forth around assessment, and maybe the three of you could give some concrete examples maybe of how you've approached assessment during this period. It might be really helpful for other teachers and leaders in our community.
Yeah, so assessing online has it's definitely been a challenge, but we've been fortunate enough where all the secondary students were already on a bring your own device one-to-one program already. So when we shifted online, everything was on Google Classroom already. They've been used to that way of working with the Google Suites and whatnot. But one of the key things, as I said earlier, was basically just scaling down. Less is more right now. I think when you're in the classroom and you're thinking about summative assessments and formative assessments, personally, I find in the middle years, you always have that pressure from the IGCSE or whatever program you're doing, and then the IB diploma or A levels, whatever it is you're doing. And when you're a teacher that's so conscious of backwards planning from with the end in mind, knowing what the kids need in IGCSE, knowing what the kids in IB diploma, you always have that at the back of your head where it's giving me this unconscious pressure to, oh no, they gotta do this, I gotta help them transition effectively, because we know that IGCSE, it becomes a very content-heavy curriculum. Then we move on to IB Diploma, which is kind of the integration of skills and content. And in the IMYC, we've always focused a lot more on kind of the skill-based, kind of the conceptual focus of learning. So we've really tried to scale back and just focus on what are the core essential skills for the year 9 students, which they will need in the year 10. So does it matter that they're not reading Shakespeare? No, it doesn't. They just need to know how to write a proper piece of writing so they can tackle the content. They need to know how to do a proper lab report, have that skill for research so they're able to tackle the content in IGCSE. So we've really just kind of looked at our summative assessments and kind of our whole planning and literally cutting it down by 50% of the learning objectives in terms of what are the non-negotiables and key essential learning objectives that these students will need for the next year. So especially for their 9s moving on to year 10, and then also with the year 7s moving into year 8. I would say for the year 7 and 8, we've had less pressure for that. We were very open-minded, very flexible, showcase your learning within while highlighting these learning objectives. Year 9, we had to put a little more emphasis on a bit more flexibility, knowing what they need to be prepared for in year 10. But for the kind of the gist of things is we've if you look at our unit plans for the last unit, the assessment objectives, the learning objectives from the IMYC curriculum, it's more or less half. There's maybe like just 5 or 4 key skills that we really wanted to hone in on, because we knew that with 30-minute classes, you're not going to cover what you're going to cover in an 80-minute block or an in-class schedule. So less is more. That's kind of my takeaway, is less is more for all the assessments right now.
Sure. Thank you, Rico. Colin, you want to jump in? You have any comments on how you've approached assessment during this time?
I mean, yeah, we've, again, it's the advantage of being in Google Classroom and assignments in terms of commenting and using those AFL rubrics and general rubric-based feedback, as you can still keep, particularly for the skills, you can still keep that flowing quite naturally, where the tasks themselves a lot of the time can shift roughly to an online equivalent, and the students can still get that good quality of feedback. And in fact, what I would actually say is probably got more feedback than they normally would during online learning, because I think myself and all my colleagues tended to be giving detailed replies to every task that would be submitted to us. And normally that might be more verbal. You're going through and you're giving the verbal feedback along with the rubric and the general guidance. But because that's all getting typed back now, they've got that to refer back to every single time. So I'd say that one of the interesting things I think is, in terms of the amount of feedback that the learners were getting, probably as we shifted into online learning to distance learning, is I don't know more. It's probably just a different format. They'd still be getting that same level of advice. It was just taking a different way of doing it. So that was certainly skills. In terms of knowledge, you still have the ways of just answering quick questions and getting those assignments back to the kids. We did elect, we'd already done the ISA, the International Schools Assessment, early in the year in terms of looking at standardized tests. We normally would also do the GL assessments as well for maths and English, but we elected to we felt like we had enough data from the ISAs. There was no need to do a second standardized assessment, so we did elect not to participate in that this time round. And in fact, I believe in terms of the school, we're now weighing up whether we even need to actually do 2 standardized assessments, and in fact, we just elect to do 1, because really that's where the information is. We don't really need to go much further than that. So that in itself has helped us ask the right questions about the nature of assessment in our school.
Super. Thank you, Colin. And I think, it's nice to see this similarity about, asking the question about, what's really important in terms of assessment, because we know, you assess what you value, etc. Not a place to discuss that in any detail, but I appreciate that what you're really saying is those broad key understandings, those essential understandings or so, as well as the skills. And we know that those are the ways that our curriculum has been designed. Jason, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll just be quick. I'll just talk about the summative assessments that we did at the end of year. So we didn't refer to them as exams intentionally. We did, because when we did refer to them as exams in April, it created angst amongst the student community, as exams do. But the difference being that we're dealing with this online. So the face-to-face conversations about decreasing stress during examination periods couldn't pervade as effectively as what we would have hoped for. So we moved from no longer having exams, we had summative assessment week. That already changed the whole tone of that period. And for our students, what we did was we asked staff for 5 core subjects to prepare a 1-hour exam / summative assessment task. We connected with our parent body, and we gave students 2.5 hours to complete this 1-hour task. So we were mindful that we weren't able to monitor them sitting there using the old instructional literally 1.5 meters away from their friends, COVID and or otherwise, sitting there in rows. We worked with the parents to ensure that we would start so we were using Google Teams, so we set it as an assignment at 9 o'clock, and we were online the whole time. They had to be online as well. By 11:30, they had to submit it. Now, it wasn't a disingenuous process for us. What it did was it took away the stress. Students were not constrained by time. They completed some fantastic work for us. Our response to the work was less about testing their knowledge. It was more about testing their skills. And the students were incredibly grateful to us for creating this assessment week that reflected the context that we're currently living in. And I can't say that next year they won't be sitting in rows doing their IGCSE exams in accordance to Cambridge's expectations, but we just adapted our summative assessments to the current context, and it worked.
That's great. Thanks, Jason. And I think one thing all three of you through the course of our discussion today has really highlighted about me how we frame the language around learning. You know, all of you have talked about, oh, we didn't call it an exit point, we called it a showcase of learning, or demonstrate your understanding, or an assessment week, these sorts of things. And it's amazing how we reshape our language or reframe the way we talk about something to accommodate student perception around that. And it contributes, I think, one more time to that beginning conversation we said about, like, how are we supporting our students emotionally and their well-being? And I think by de-escalation sounds a little bit dramatic, but, you know, by changing the language we use, it changes student perception around some of these learning experiences that they, you know, are presented with. So I really want to highlight how all of you have really shown that to us, that we can, you know, make choices around that, and it really has an impact on students. So I want to thank you for that. Shall we go and kind of wrap it up and address some of the questions that have come into the chat for us today? One of the questions that, I mean, it might seem quite big, but, you know, at the end of the day, you know, we're at our webinar today because we're invested in learning. So what is the most important piece of advice, or what is the most important at this time for educators, would the three of you say right now?
Realigning and redefining the pedagogy that we deliver. We continually speak about we are trying to be newfound transformational learners, enriching our students with the colloquial 21st century skills. And then this happens and we start to realise we haven't changed that much. There's a lot of work to do. And if ever there's a time globally that we are on the precipice of significant change in education, then the online learning has taught us so much, and it's been an immeasurable opportunity. And not just saying it because it's cool to say it as a leader, as an educator in education, but it's real. It's the reality that what we've been doing. Let's see this as an opportunity to change our position and to understand that the head, heart, and soul of our students is paramount and must be taken into account, because as I've heard my other colleagues share, everything comes from a well-being, their safety, their heart, how they present themselves, the smile, the awe, the wonderment. And we must take that into consideration moving forward. I feel like this is a political speech. We must take this into consideration. I noticed my hands were moving, so my hands don't move that much when I speak. So I realised that
your oration
my hands move all the time.
Yeah.
I can't talk without my hands. So
Go on, Colin. What at this time is the most important?
Do you know what it is? And I think, you know, when we were planning this out, and we were discussing like at the heart, what do we want to get out of this, and what message are we wanting to share with educators? And I think it's that idea of reassurance as well. That idea that, you know, you're not going to be hitting on maybe all of the learning goals you planned this year. You might not be hitting on all the things that you hoped you would, but so long as those children's or so long as anyone's learning is moving forward, and so long as those children still feel, you're getting that sense that they feel well-being, motivated, and connected, those are the things that you should really put at the heart of everything. That's the things that you should care about. If you don't think that, you know, an exit point in the structure you may use it in the school is going to work, and that's not beneficial to your learners in this context, that's fine. Like, these things are okay, because you're reflecting the needs of your learners. You're taking an understanding for what they need, and yes, you still want to be that teacher, and you still want to make sure their learning moves forward. And so long as you're still helping them that journey, you know, that's the important thing. And that's the thing that we all need to remember in this context as well. It's a very difficult thing. And we need to make sure that we're not worrying ourselves as well. Like, I'm not doing all these things I need to do, and putting ourselves under that immense pressure. But everyone's in the same boat. The world's in the same boat. You know, that we're all going to be moving in the same direction.
Yeah, about compassion, eh? Yeah, thank you, Colin. Rico, do you want to make some last comments for us today?
Can you hear me? Yeah, you're good, right? Yeah, I needed to hear that, Colin, about the exit point. I needed to hear that after a long year, so I appreciate that, man. Yeah, no, a lot. I really agree with what Jason has said, what Colin has said, just about what's most important right now, because, you know, like Jason has said, there's no COVID police checking up on whether or not we're doing the correct thing. There's no right way to do this online learning. And it's so important for educators to remember that this is uncharted territory. We were never trained to teach online. We didn't go to teachers college to learn how to teach remotely. We wanted to get into education to interact with the kids, to be personal, to make those genuine connections. And this is a great territory where no one really has a right answer. There's no textbook answer for this, and it's okay not to know. And I think it's so important to reach out, especially during this period where everyone's in a similar situation. Collaborate with people, you know, like Danielle and Colin has already, which Jason and we will collaborate. Reaching out and going beyond your scope, whether it's a local network, global network, reach out on Twitter, reach out on different forums and stuff. We're all in this together. So the more we share, the easier it is for us to get through this, because at the end of the day, no one really has the answer or knows what they're doing at this point. We're just trying to make the best out of the situation within our context and do what's best for our kids and, of course, the staff as well. Remember, we're all educators. We need to be looking after ourselves just as much as we're looking after the kids. It all starts with ourselves, with our well-being, before we can take care of the kids. And I think that would be what's most important for me right now.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen. Yeah, I think, you know, we started it talking about well-being, and it's no accident that we're closing it talking about well-being. And as you mentioned, you know, for us as educators as much as for the students. Sorry? Oh, I think I just want to get some input. Maybe Sneha can tell us. We have a few comments in the chat box that I can see, but I'm not sure. Would you like to go through those, or would you like we can touch on them, or would you? I'm just conscious of our time. Maybe Sneha can jump in and kind of give us a little bit of direction on how to kind of close up our discussion for today.
Sure. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to all of our presenters. I think it's been a really informative and thorough conversation today that we've certainly thoroughly enjoyed listening to and hearing about, and just witnessing your dynamic between colleagues, and generally just the level of support that you have provided to your students as well as to your colleagues across the world. And I think it's safe to say that the main points that have come across today that we've all been discussing and listening to and hearing about is just the planning to reflect the needs of the learners, how well-being and emotional health of the students as well as educators and teachers is something that is fundamental, and that educators need to remember, as Rico mentioned, that this is uncharted territory, and we go into get into education, to interact with our students, and of course reaching out, collaborating, and going beyond your scope and your network is certainly important and vital at this time. And just reading through, I'm going to read through some of the comments, as Danielle mentioned, just to be mindful of time. We can see that there's a question from Neil saying a really interesting point from Jason, endorsed by Danielle, narrowing the formality of the relationship between teachers and students. So the question from this is a more general one, and how do teachers and students negotiate this new relationship, and what guidance might be provided for both groups, and indeed how are you going to continue with this? How do you plan on taking this forward?
Yeah, I don't know. Do you have some ideas around that? I know, Jason, you brought that up, but certainly I'm sure Colin and Rico, you've also, through the course of our webinar today, explained how you have narrowed that gap as well yourselves. Is it something that can be sustained moving forward, or is it something that you think is more unique to this context?
I'll jump in. Yeah, for me personally, I don't think it's unique to this context. I think with teaching teenagers, it's sometimes so hard to not take things personally, because we know how difficult some of these teenager students can be in the classroom. I think it's a big mindset thing. I think a lot of times teachers, oftentimes when they're in the classroom, they have this expectation that they need to be the teacher. They need to present themselves as a teacher, and I see a lot of this with a lot of teachers where I talk to them. I say, "Hey, you're not Danielle in the classroom. You're not Jason in the classroom. You're not Colin in the classroom. I'm losing that spark." And I think it's so important for teachers to be vulnerable. I think it's so important to be vulnerable in the classroom, where kids can see, "Oh, wow, Miss Danielle actually has flaws. She's not a robot and is not perfect. Oh, Mr. Colin also has his issues. He makes mistakes." Being vulnerable, I think, is so important, just to let kids know that, you're human, and making every effort to show that you care about them outside of the classroom. Like my core philosophy is that you can't teach teenagers or any students unless you've built positive and genuine relationships with them. I honestly believe that it all starts with relationships. Education comes second. You can't have education with a teenager without the relationship in place, because we know how moody they can be. We know how often they say, "You don't understand me, Mom. You don't understand me." We know how they get sometimes, where it's so important to show them that you care about them. So I think this isn't limited to a remote learning. Certainly with a remote learning setting, my staff have found it very beneficial to have the time to interact with these students outside of class time. Because when you're interacting with students outside of class time, you don't have the pressure of the lesson and the learning objectives and all the assessments. You can just focus on the person, seeing the student as a person, not as a student. That would be my 2 cents on it.
Rico?
I was, in case anyone wonders if I keep on looking off to the side, it's because I always keep on scribbling down my own thoughts so I don't forget them, or my concern about my own dementia. I think what Rico's got in there, and what I just put down in the notepad, it's a difference between attitude here, and I think it's a difference between viewing yourself as a teacher and a facilitator. And I mean teacher in the very classical sense of being very directed, as opposed to looking at yourself in the classroom as that you're facilitating the learning, you're helping them to move forward, and you're part of that process and that journey, not the all-knowing font of knowledge without flaws. I think I've been very beneficial in working at a school for a long time where that is the culture anyway. Again, we're a first name culture. It's Mr. Colin, and I wouldn't say that anyone's ever been accused me of not being Mr. Colin in the classroom either. I had some interesting emails from students who are leaving about the fact that they will now never forget the lyrics to "Come On Eileen," as I used to play 80s music in the classroom while they were working away. But I think that's the thing. That's more. I think it's that idea that some people still have that very classical mindset that a teacher must know everything and they must not be shown to be making mistakes. And I think the more you can start to to twist that mindset into the fact that actually we're helping to facilitate and move learners forward, and we're building a relationship with them, while not losing that sense of professional distance as well. Like it's making sure that there is still that part of the school relationship too. And that's a very difficult thing to balance, but I think it's those elements together that hopefully will continue forward as schools move forward after this time.
Thanks, Colin. I've been looking through the chat more closely as you guys have been speaking, and I think a lot of it has been people's comments based on what you're saying and kind of reaffirming how what we've been discussing today is also resonating for them in their context. But I do see one more specific context that was kind of talking about collaboration between schools. And I know, Rico, I think it was Rico, you were touching on, expanding your network and, be involved in a online community as teachers. And I think it's something that true confession, I forget myself to reach out beyond my own community or my own network. And so the question is, as we have these kinds of online learning environments, how could we possibly kind of increase or formalize that cross-school collaboration? I know Rico and Jason are going to one-up me and Colin pretty quick. But how can, we have the pinboard, for example, like maybe we can amplify our use of the pinboard, or what other ways could we bring that up more?
If I can jump on this one very, very quickly, because I was just thinking about the pinboard there as you're talking about it. And I think one of the ways that might help facilitate that a little bit better is in the current form of the pinboard, it's just all sort of posts on top of each other. And so I think it's harder to make sure that things are sort of itemized in a way that would be easier to find, to collaborate and facilitate. So looking forward, if we can find ways as IMYC professionals that perhaps it is some sort of forum where we can have, okay, who's working on these entry point ideas, and that's always there. So you've got the big ideas and these things, who's doing it this time? Because those do happen in the pinboard, but sometimes because of the way it's not particularly organized by interest or design, or certainly I'll be guilty in a minute, not since the last time I checked, which was a little while ago now. I think that those ways are very quick ways that are more dynamic conversations, but are easier to find and participate in, because a natural flowing thing like a Twitter or anything like that's a very of the moment thing. And sometimes to really get those conversations off the ground in terms of partnership, it really needs to start asynchronous before then it can become synchronous.
Thanks, Paul. Anybody else want to chime in? Certainly okay if we don't. Anyways, I think those are the questions. I don't know if Sneha, if I've missed anything. It looks to me like those are the main questions that came out.
Yes, I think you've touched upon pretty much all the questions and probably answering everyone's questions as you were having your discussion, which is why there's not many that are specifically. But before we complete sort of or round off today's webinar, I think I'd really like to sort of touch on a comment that I've just seen in the chat from Elaine, and just I think it's a lovely way to sort of just sum up what the return to school might be like. And he's written that the return to school will set fertile land for teacher and pupils to reflect on how learning has been before and after, and what things we need to maintain in our new current teaching learning repertoire here. And I think that's just such a lovely way to sum up the very interesting and relevant conversation that has taken place today. And of course, it wouldn't have been possible without our roundtable of speakers, and our sincere thanks to you all, Danielle, Rico, Colin and Jason, for sharing your insights and thoughts and experiences with us today. We've thoroughly enjoyed listening to the level of support that you've provided your students as well as your colleagues across the world. And Danielle, thank you very much for helming the conversation and taking charge today. I think it's been really wonderful to see how you've actually all been collaborating yourselves as well, and hopefully it's something that we can definitely take forward. And Colin, we will bear in mind the ideas about the pinboard. Definitely something to continue discussing. And
it just came to my mind. Sorry.
Absolutely, no. I think it's definitely a valid point, and we will definitely consider how we can improve that in the future. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So For our 20th webinar for the Stay Connected 20 series, which will be taking place next week, we will focus on the recovery curriculum, in which we'll be exploring the recovery plans, including the UNICEF plan that Rico mentioned earlier, that outline the plan and outline of reopening. And our collaborative partner Jigsaw is also offering a free recovery package for secondary schools with children aged 11 to 16 returning to the classroom. And this is a free resource for everyone. If you'd like to click on the link that's available on the screen, we will share the slides with you as well after this webinar, so that you would be able to access this resource, and hopefully it will prove useful in planning for your reopening schools in a couple of weeks' time, a couple of months' time, depending on where you are in the world. If we could move on to the next slide. Again, before we round off, thank you very much indeed to Danielle, Rico, Colin and Jason for joining us today. If you would like to get in touch regarding this webinar or any of the other webinars that we've conducted in the past or are planning to do in the future, please do contact me about any aspect of the learning today, or indeed about the implementation of our international curriculum. We will do our best to address any questions in the information sent out, but I do believe we've touched upon all the main points that we've been discussing today, and a recording of the webinar will also be sent out to you shortly after the webinar is complete, and this information will include a link to our post-webinar survey, but you may find it easier to use the QR code showing again on the screen, and we welcome your feedback and input to shaping the topics for future sessions. You can also connect with us online through our various social media platforms as shown on the screen now. If I could kindly ask our presenters to stay back for a few minutes before we round off today's webinar, I'd truly appreciate that. And for today, thank you very much for joining us. Please all take care and stay safe. And if you could kindly click on the leave icon, we will be able to complete the recording of the webinar. Thank you.